Y'all, I have a lot that I want to talk about today. I want to reflect briefly on where I'm at as a writer, what I'm doing, why I'm doing it. I want to speak concretely about who I'm reading right now: Flannery O'Connor, Samantha Schweblin, Shirley Jackson, what I'm learning from these amazing writers and how they're helping me define my aesthetic. I want to talk about writing characters that has to do with thinking about painting. And I'm excited and try to go through piece by piece by piece all the little things that happened in my writing week, share them with you, and by sharing them, enrich them for myself. So thank you in advance for being here and listening and being in this space with me. The biggest advantage that I've found so far by starting an authortube channel is I'm being more deliberate about how I spend my writing time, what I'm reading. I'm thinking really strategically about the story of my life as a writer that I'm writing, as it were, as an artist. And I'm going to dig in today. So I want to start with a little bit of kind of the story of how I got to this point where I've recently started identifying myself as a short story writer. And that's a huge evolution in my life and my professional life. If it's your first time here, my professional background in writing is in many things besides fiction. My big creative project to date was a series I wrote for Audible starring Stephanie Hsu. I studied playwriting and theater in school. I worked as a professional journalist writing for Vice and The Guardian and ESPN for many years. It's really only now, and I'm 41 years old, that I started writing fiction. And it's amazing because I feel like I have found in the short story the type of expression through language that I will pursue for the rest of my life. I feel like I have found the thing. I'm so attracted by the idea that this is something masterable. Obviously, it's an entire art form, but I feel like if I read thousands of short stories and write hundreds of short stories, that I will write something special in this form. And by the time I'm said and done and they put me in the grave, I want to have left my mark on this form. My ambition and goal is nothing short of that. I do these weekly goal-setting videos. They're live streams every morning around 9 my time. I live here in Mexico City. That's mountain time. Each video, I identified the big idea, the big goal for the week. And usually what this has to do with is something besides writing. It has to do with kind of a lifestyle idea, because I really think that to write well, both from a kind of productivity point of view, to build a writing habit and a building life, but also to write well, which is to say to articulate something specific to you, something special. The artist part of being a writer requires thinking about things in your life and your relationships and your health that are apart from kind of the craft of it all. And my big idea this week was to do one thing at a time for longer stretches of a time. And all I meant by that was not multitask, not be on my phone, and to try to be more present in all parts of my life, and so that I'm more present in my writing. And I found success there. I brought up on Monday that I stopped bringing my phone with me when I was walking my dogs, started seeing things in my neighborhood that I'd never seen before. And I tried doing that other places of my life, kind of mindfulness, if you will, whether I was eating, just like, okay, I'm going to do nothing except eat this meal right now for the next 12 minutes. That was the big idea, and I was successful with that, and I want to continue to pursue that in the coming weeks. Writing updates. On the writing front, I started a new story. That was another goal I set at the beginning of the week, to start a new story, and I'm really excited about this. I'm tentatively going to call it Under the Pear Tree. And a real revelation around this story is that I noticed that the creative spark for it came from the same place as the last story that I completed. So I just finished a Christmas horror story, tentatively called Santa Story. And the origin of that story, what happened for me was I just came up with a situation that guaranteed conflict, that guaranteed action, and it worked. So the context in that story is we have this like tween girl who knows that the man wearing the Santa suit at the mall is having an affair with her mother. So she goes to Santa, sits down there on the bench, has a wish list, and on the wish list it says, "Stop my mother." It's a threat to end this affair. That's where the story started. I didn't know what it was about. I didn't know that it was actually about Santa and not the girl. I didn't know whose story it was. I didn't know what the thematic meat of it was. It turns out that it's kind of about this particular guy's like listlessness and powerlessness, kind of about sex and his inability to manage that in his life to his emotional detriment. I didn't know any of that, but I had that dramatic situation, and it empowered me to get to the end of the story confidently and quickly and have that first draft right away. And so, I think that's just the dramatic writer in me. I think that's the playwright in me. But it's like, okay, hey, that's what I have to work with. And I'm reading about how other writers that I really admire, I've been reading a lot about how Samantha Schweblin writes her short stories, and I'll talk about that in this video as well. I have a very cool definition of a short story from her that I want to share with you. It was useful to identify, oh, that really worked for you, because then I applied the exact same thing this week to this new story, Under the Pear Tree. And essentially there, the setup is that you have two brothers and there's a dog, and one of the brothers, the dog belongs to one of the brothers, and it bites his brother's kid, his nephew, pretty severely. And it's the kind of thing that in a lot of contexts would lead a dog owner to put down their dog to prevent this from happening again. And the dog owner doesn't want to do it, and the father of the bit child is insisting on it, and the overt conflict is to put down the dog or not, but it's really about some much deeper stuff between these two brothers. And it's like this kind of conflict is bringing to the surface all that stuff. And I don't know what it's about yet. I don't fully know whether it's stuff to do with their dad, is it have to do with one of the brothers' partners who really doesn't like the other brother? I don't really know. Those characters are starting to pop up. They're starting to populate the story. There's a sense of place, but the story is coming quickly, and I think it's for that same reason, which is to say that I created a strong dramatic setup to an engine for the story part of it. And so I'm just identifying that as kind of a successful tool for me as a writer. And that was a really exciting conclusion of the week. On the reading front, this is very cool. I want to talk about Shirley Jackson a little bit, although I really want to talk about Flannery O'Connor, because her work, which I fell in love with years and years and years ago, made me think about characters in painting. The year I fell in love with Flannery O'Connor was also the year that the Met Museum in New York City had an exhibit called Glitter and Doom, which were a series of art that came out of the Weimar Republic. This is like 1920s Germany, and I found that the aesthetic of those paintings, and I'll get into the specifics of that, really recalled for me the aesthetics of Flannery O'Connor's characters. And so that was another kind of exciting thing that happened this week, is that I remembered that because I hadn't revisited these stories in forever. And so by revisiting Flannery O'Connor, I revisited that way of thinking about character, which is that, character, there's all the ways we think about character in terms of the human, but I was thinking about them as stylized, how authors stylize their characters, because Flannery O'Connor very much is a stylist when it comes to her characters. I read Young, Goodman, Brown, and I had a really cool reading experience there as well, because I read that out loud on the channel, and I read it before on my own, before reading it out loud, with the idea being like, if I read it once, I will have a better sense of what this story is about, so that when I perform it, as it were, I won't have to be answering questions on the spot. But what I found was actually that reading it cold forces me to focus more on the story, because that's what I did 2 weeks ago when I read Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft out loud. I was going in cold, and so I was more attentive to the text. So that was kind of an interesting reading experience in terms of kind of identifying where my consciousness is most like active and engaged and dynamic. And I noticed in reading out loud a lower level of that, and I didn't feel as good about the performance of that reading, because I think that at some level my consciousness was elsewhere and not just on the text. And so, this is all part of this larger conversation that I'm constantly having with myself, specifically recently, about where is my consciousness? Where is it most clear and clean and focused on one thing at a time? Because for me, that is where the best writing comes from, when my capacity to listen is deepest, when my brain is out there on the glacier where the quietest places on earth, and it's just like picking up these like little micro cracks in the ice that are like negative 32 decibels. That kind of specificity, that kind of perception of the universe is what's going to give me the kind of fiction is both most rewarding to write, because I think I'll articulate parts of myself that I didn't know until finding them, but also most rewarding to read and special and unique and soulful. You know, I think the AI conversation is like pretty boring overall, but it's worth looping in here that if on the one hand you have repetitive LLM nonsense, and on the other hand you have like real writing where it's connected to someone's lived experience, well, the other end of the spectrum is like your secret lived experience that you don't even know consciously you're living, that the deepest, most true, least artificial part of you actually requires cultivating to get access to. Now I'm going to talk about Samantha Schweblin, who is an Argentine writer. She writes incredible, nuanced short stories. She inspires me. I watched an interview of hers, which I'll link, and she kind of defined what a short story is for her. So I'm going to read that, and then after that, we'll talk a little bit more in depth about painting and characters. And, after that, we'll sort of set the stage for next week. I just want to give you everything I have. So in defining what a short story is, I am a new short story writer, and I'm trying to identify what makes a short story from an experiential point of view. I think there are certain kind of craft or narrative definitions. It has a beginning, middle, and end. A useful definition I picked up from Joyce Carol Oates is that a short story encapsulates a before and after moment in someone's life, kind of a singular moment. But in terms of what it is to read and feel and experience a short story, I find Samantha Schweblin's definition really valuable. So again, Samantha Schweblin, she wrote Mouthful of Birds, she wrote Fever Dream. These are English titles of her Spanish language work. She just came out with a collection called Good and Evil. This is an excerpt from an interview of hers. For me, writing is not about the idea or the plot. The plot is almost an anecdote for me. I always want to reach a very exact emotional state, but so exact and so sharp that there are no words to say it. I need an 8-page story, a series of thousands of words in order to attain that unique and precise emotional state. The plot is only a bridge between my emotional state. It's the bridge to channel all that into the reader's chest. As for me, the most important thing is that final emotion and not so much the story. So that is a really useful North Star for me, is thinking about a short story as an opportunity to impart a highly specific emotional experience rather than to provide someone with a riveting tale or story. Ironically, I've really been kind of a story-forward writer, but I think that I was really kind of inoculated with a Hollywood mentality. The last few years, I was really trying to break into TV writing in Hollywood unsuccessfully. And so I really started to privilege story and plot. And now, which is incredibly artistically liberating, I'm finding that I'm jettisoning that way of thinking in favor of something similar to what Schweblin just described, which is that I'm interested in mainlining some kind of hyper-specific emotional experience, and that the story being told, yes, is an important engine. Yes, we need to keep turning the pages. Yes, some stories are going to function better than others in imparting that specific emotional idea. But at the end of the day, that's what it's about, and that's what the pursuit is. So that's the big takeaway in terms of defining a short story. Okay, painting and characterization. So quickly, I'm going to try to do this quickly. I would say that Flannery O'Connor has an aesthetic of the grotesque in her characters. Her characters feel real in that they feel like real people, but in terms of their description and the way they are, they're all kind of freaks. She has explicit freaks in her stories, but even the sort of protagonist or the straight man, if you will, of the story are very heightened, very strange. And I'm going to read you an example here. So this is from A Good Man is Hard to Find, a story by Flannery O'Connor, the title story of this collection. This is just listen to the way that O'Connor introduces this character. Bailey didn't look up from his reading, so she wheeled around, then faced the children's mother. A young woman in slacks whose face was as broad and innocent as a cabbage. This is paragraph 2 of this story, and O'Connor's already using a really loose, playful, and I would argue grotesque prose to describe this character. And what I love about that is that you can see this same kind of aesthetic rendering in painting. So I'm just going to put up some more paintings here from that exhibit, Glitter and Doom. And it's like these people in these images do not look like real people, nor does anyone's face really look like a cabbage. But in each case, this woman whose face looks like a cabbage and these portraits, they still feel real. And what I'm seeing here is this amazing stylization that still feels grounded. This doesn't feel speculative. It feels grounded, but is absurd. And so just think it's really valuable when thinking about the way that I'm characterizing, the way that I'm presenting my characters, the words in which I'm using to describe them. Think about painting, and if you think about Impressionism, it's like, okay, those don't look like people, but they embody a feeling. They still are figures. What are the analogs there, right? If what we just read is grotesque to grotesque, if the Weimar Republic portraits and Flannery O'Connor's prose is dual expressions of a grotesque aesthetic, what's comparable? What's the prose version of Impressionism? Anyway, I just wanted to share that thought. I find it useful. Maybe you would find it useful. If it's your first time here, I'm so glad you're here. I am pursuing a path and a life of literature and ideas and joy and community on this channel. Would love to have you back. And if you want to participate, there's a Discord of writers and readers. There are 2 story clubs, the ones I mentioned. And yeah, I'd love to connect in this digital parasocial way. YouTube is proving to be an amazing time and experience for me. I'll see you next week.